So yeah, this takes place shortly after we looked in chapter 1 where the disciples began following Jesus. Now that they were in Cana of Galilee, and Jesus, his family, and his disciples were invited to a wedding, to a marriage supper. And they're there, and they ran out of wine. This is kind of an embarrassing thing that would happen to these people. They will have a bad reputation. People will remember that these guys at their wedding ran out of wine. So Jesus' mother comes to him, and he answers her, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." Which sounds a little like it would be harsh for us, but it's really not. It's he's actually, the way he's addressing her there, it's kind of like saying, instead of just saying mother, I think it's showing that he's a grown man addressing her, not just saying like mommy or something, he's calling her woman. It's more of a polite term. He says, what does this have to do with us? This isn't our problem. In other words, he says, my hour is not yet come. He's referring to his ministry. I don't want to say that he's not supposed to be in the spotlight yet. That makes him sound like some kind of star, but he's not. This isn't his time yet to start revealing himself through his miracles and his public ministry. He's telling her that, what, this isn't for me yet, but he does it anyway. She says to the servants, do whatever he saith to you. She tells him to just trust him, do whatever he says. And so he actually tells them to take these 6 water pots. It says it was after the manner of purifying the Jews, that contained 2 or 3 firkins apiece, which is something like 20 gallons. So they're pretty big water pots, and it says they're used for purifying. In other words, they're for washing the hands and the feet. The servants would wash the people's feet, would be very dusty and things. So these things that were actually used for cleaning purposes, he tells them to take this and fill them with water, and they do it. And he says to draw some out and bear it to the governor of the feast, meaning kind of like the guy who's overseeing all the servants, telling them, making sure everybody has their food, everybody's being served the wine and things. He's kind of like the head over all the servants there at this wedding, and they take it to him, and he says, the ruler of the feast tasted the water that was made wine. He didn't know where it came from, but the servants knew. They're probably laughing like, this guy's drinking dirty water from washing people's feet or something. They're probably, and he calls to the bridegroom that's, who just got married. He says, mostly people bring out the good wine at the beginning for people to drink. Once they've had a lot, they start getting drunk. They don't know that if they're drinking good or bad wine at that point. So he says, usually people bring out the good stuff first. But he said, you've saved the best wine until the end. And he doesn't realize that this was just dirty water a minute ago, but they brought it, and Jesus did this miracle and turned the water into wine. And I think that the significance, this is his first miracle. It says that this was the beginning of the miracles Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. The first one, this public miracle that manifested his glory, and his disciples believed on him. They were already following him. We saw that they already believed that he was the Son of God, the Messiah. It said when John the Baptist, his apostles, when he told them that this was the Son of God, they began following Jesus. Then we saw the other ones. Nathaniel began following him when he said he saw him under the fig tree and stuff. They already believed on him, but they see this miracle now, and that's really giving them conviction that this guy's something special. He's doing incredible miracles here. That really caused them to begin to believe. But I think the significance here, you wonder, why would Jesus do a miracle like this when he was busy healing people, raising the dead and things? Why turn this water into wine? It has to do with this transformation of taking dirty water and turning it into this delicious wine. I think it shows like a picture of how he takes dirty sinners, and how he turns them into these glorious sons of God, that we become like Jesus through this transformation. I think it's kind of the imagery that the Bible often uses, these different images to help us teach and understand the things, heavenly things. So it's a pretty big deal for these people. So here's his first miracle. It says, after this he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples, and they continued there not many days. So the next part is this. Would you want to read it for us?
Sure.
How about?
And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my father's house an house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scriptures and the word which Jesus had said.
And there's a couple.
Oh, there's more. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover, in the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of men, for he knew what was in man.
So, what's interesting about this is he's here cleansing the temple, and this in the other Gospels, the other 3 books here, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they record this event at the end of Jesus' ministry, and John here has it at the beginning. So it's possible that he actually did it more than once, and that could be, or it's just possible that John saw a different significance here, and he didn't put his stuff all just in chronological order. Each of the writers here had a little bit different things that they were trying to portray and teach about Jesus' life. So it's possible, but like I say, it could be either way. It could be just that he had to do this multiple times. I mean, he went. But it's again on Passover. I want to talk about that a little bit, and just in case you're not familiar, it begins. It's what's so fascinating, interesting about the Bible. The whole story, it's all leading up to Jesus. From the very beginning, God had this plan to send his son. It was all about the cross. It was all about saving us, So right from the very beginning, we understand, even when Adam and Eve were in the garden and they sinned, God already had the plan. He already knew what he was going to do. So when we look at the Old Testament, we read all this story about the Hebrews, the Jews, their history and stuff. There's so many interesting stories. If you go through the beginning there, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. So we come to the part about Joseph, and if you know anything about him, his brothers were very jealous of him. He was favored. He was telling him he was going to be ruling over them someday, and they end up they want to kill him. They decide, but one of the brothers talk him into, let's just sell him for slavery here, and they tell his dad that he died, and so he goes through all kinds of interesting events, and eventually ends up becoming second in Egypt only to Pharaoh. It's really interesting story if you've read it, and eventually he's there to save the people. There's a famine, and he's put in charge. He stores up food so he can basically save the world. I mean, he's storing all the food, and people are coming from all over. Eventually his brothers come there, and they're looking for food, and he knows who they are, but they don't recognize him, so he kind of messes with them a little bit here. If you know the story, he puts things in their bags and make it look like they've stolen things and stuff, and eventually he reveals himself. He forgives them. He asks them to bring their father and their families and stuff, and they bring the whole Hebrew clans all into Egypt. And then years go by, and the Hebrews, the Israelites, they grow into this big nation. I think it's something like 2 million people or more. And the Pharaoh, he's getting nervous that there's such a large people. He thinks that there's going to be trouble. So he decides he wants all the firstborn males, the babies, to be killed. So if you know anything about Moses, his mom actually puts him in a basket on the river, and he ends up being saved and raised by Pharaoh's daughter. So he's raised in the palace there. He's given an education, which is how he ends up writing down all the first 5 books of the Bible. Up till then, they have been just passed down orally or things, recorded just verbally from one to another. So he actually records and writes them down after he is educated. So that's how we come to have that Bible. And he leads people. He even has an interesting story where he sees one of the Hebrews being mistreated, and he kills one of the Egyptians, and he leaves for a while, but eventually God calls him back to come lead the people out of Israel. And if you know the story there, Pharaoh won't let them leave, so God has to send 10 plagues, and he sends frogs and locusts, darkness, turns water into wine, boils, all these horrible things. And finally the last one is that all the firstborn males, an angel is going to come kill all the firstborn males of all the people and the animals. And except for the Jews there, they're told to kill a lamb and put the blood on the doorposts of their house so that the angel will pass over them. And that's the beginning of Passover. And it's, again, when we talked about Jesus being the Lamb of God, that's that imagery there of him being that sacrifice so that God's wrath and judgment will pass over us, that we will be saved and forgiven. And so you've got this real interesting thing. So Jesus is here. This is 1,300 years later, and they're still celebrating Passover. It becomes one of their holidays. They do a week-long celebration here. And they go up, a lot of them will go up to Jerusalem, like it would be like the main place because of the temple and stuff. So here's Jesus going up for the Passover to Jerusalem, as they said, and he gets there and he finds the temple. These guys are selling all the animals for sacrifices. Well, that's actually allowed, it's permitted. But you've ever been to like an airport, you've probably seen people will sell things there, same things you can buy outside the airport, but they cost like 2 or 3 times more. They charge you way more because you're kind of stuck there. You kind of have to pay a premium, right, for the food or clothes or whatever it is you want to buy, little phone chargers or things, right? And I think these guys were taking advantage of the situation. They said all these people are here for the Passover, and they aren't able to bring their sacrifices with them, so we have to sell it here. And they say, well, these people need it. We can charge them whatever. So they probably charged them 3 or 4 times more just to make money off it. They just turned it into this big scheme of making a lot of money, and like I said, taking advantage of these people that didn't have it in any other way. They wanted to come make a sacrifice, but they just traveled so far, they didn't have anything. So Jesus sees this. He sees that they're just being greedy, and that at the temple, which is supposed to be the heart of their worship, the place that they had to go to make their sacrifices, prayers, and things. This is, of course, before Jesus' death and resurrection, and when Paul began preaching, the grace, the gospel of grace and things, where we're now able to just access God. We don't need to make sacrifices and things. But back then, this was, like I said, this is where they come to meet with God. I mean, it's a big deal. And Jesus sees this, and he just gets angry. And you got to think, he's throwing over tables, throwing them. He makes whip, starts driving people out of the temple. He's whipping them, the animals, everything's chaos. He's flipping the tables, the money's going everywhere, it says. And people probably think he's a nut, right? I mean, they probably think he's crazy. Look at this madman. He's losing his mind. He's going in, and of course, the priests are there saying what I always say. What do you think? Who are you? What do you think you're doing? And they ask him, by what sign showest thou us that seeing that you do these things? And the Jews, they always ask for a sign. We'll see that again and again in the book here. And I think probably that's normal after they had a whole history of miraculous signs, God always doing these big miracles for them. They probably just got to the point where they need a sign for everything. Even Paul later says that Jews ask for sign and Greeks ask for wisdom. So they say, well, why are you doing this? Who do you think you are? And Jesus answers them and says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. I mean, if you would be there and see this temple, it's a huge stone, like a really impressive building. I mean, we just got back from Italy not long ago. We saw the ruins from all these ancient buildings, the Colosseum and things. And it's impressive that those things were built, a couple thousand years ago and still standing. And I mean, if you could picture this huge temple that he's looking at, and he's telling them, and they answered and said, they're laughing at him. They said, it took 46 years and probably thousands of people to build this, and you're telling us you're going to tear it down and build it back up in 3 days? And they're just mocking him. They're saying there's no way. And he says to them, they don't realize that he's talking about his body. Even his disciples didn't realize he's actually referring to his body there. It says that when they remembered what he had said when he was risen, and they believed on it. And I think a lot of the things Jesus said after he rose again, I think his disciples had to go back and reevaluate a lot of the things he said to really understand, because he mentioned time and again about, that he would have to die or things, but they didn't believe. They even Peter, he said at the end, he wanted to fight for him. He didn't want to let Jesus go die. He said he was ready. He had a sword. He was ready to fight. They didn't understand the plan here. But Jesus knew from the beginning. He understood why he was here, what he was doing. But I said after he was raised, I think they had to reconsider all these words. So they're probably talking to each other. You remember when he said this? This is what he meant. They're probably all talking and remembering everything. The Holy Spirit was bringing it back to them. Let me see where I was. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover in the feast day, many believed in his name when they saw the miracles he did. But Jesus did not commit himself unto them, because he knew all men, and needed not that any should testify of man, for he knew what was in a man. I think he's saying that he knew, they were believing him, but they weren't really sincere. They saw, it doesn't say what miracles here. I would assume he did similar to what he always did, healing the sick, possibly, healing blind people or lame people who couldn't walk, things like that, maybe raising the dead. But I think, they saw in him an opportunity. Again, these people, we just saw that they were taking advantage of people for money. I think he saw that some of these people, he said he didn't commit himself. He didn't need their testimony because he knew that they weren't being sincere about it. Either they were looking for the Messiah as a political leader, which we talked about, where he could be the king or something and save them from the Romans, or they just wanted somebody who they thought they could get free handouts or somebody who would be famous. I don't know. They didn't really, wasn't really their heart was in it. They just saw something exciting here, and he was not having it. He knew what they were up to. I think we're almost out of time. Is that
yeah, you have 5 minutes.